Well, here we go. Look at that. It is the 10th day of June as we record this episode of Now and Next. And if you're watching on the YouTube, you can see right down there, right along the bottom there, this is our cast episode. It's our comms and strategy team here bi-weekly and lots to talk about. We won't get into the weather because we bitched about the weather last time we were on. It doesn't seem to have helped whatsoever. Otherwise, let's welcome in Anne-Marie Aikins is here from AMA Communications, Lindsay Broadhead from Broadhead Communications, and Bob Reid from Broadway Strategy. And I want to start with something that you brought to the table, Bob, earlier today. And in fact, it was a piece that was on Facebook by Steve Bacon, but there has been all kinds of conversation around it. I heard News Talk 1010 is spending a good deal of time yesterday talking about it on Deb Hutton's show, and that is the 30th anniversary of the Common Sense Revolution. And I think Steve Bacon noted that it was probably the most unlikely electoral win in Ontario history when Mike Harris and the companies sort of stormed into Queen's Park with a majority after being, third place to start the election writ.
I joined Mike's staff when he was leader of the third party, and he was Mike Who and that golf pro guy from North Bay who never had a prayer. And those were lean days. Those were tough times to get attention, get noticed for anything first and foremost. And secondly, it was a long, slow process of building a brand. I think so many pundits now hold as a classic example the release of the Common Sense Revolution document a year before the expected election that took place on June 8th, 1995. It was 1994 when that full platform document was released, which had never been done before. Platforms were dribs and drabs that you announced during a campaign and then eventually would put out a document of some kind to sum it all up. So that was unprecedented. But one thing that we knew, and remember, this was after 5 years of Bob Reid's NDP government, of unprecedented levels of red ink at Queen's Park. In fairness, that government was hammered by a really deep recession that impacted badly on revenues. But there was tremendous fatigue in the province with the direction that we were heading in. And one thing that we knew from polling was that the core elements that Harris was all about were ones that would resonate really strongly with the electorate. And we knew it would take time to get there, but the polls would eventually change. And it wasn't until about halfway through the election that they actually did. We were 25-ish points behind when that writ was dropped. And so to pull a sizable majority government result out of that was really unexpected. It certainly was at the outset, and tremendously satisfying for those of us who were involved.
So at what point in that campaign did the penny drop for that team and thought, holy shit, man, we have a real shot at winning this?
I think it was about 10 days out when the sort of consensus of the major pollsters were that we were ahead and tracking really strongly. And it did put some wind in our sails. We were a happy band of warriors, and some of the touring media. My job, I was the campaign press secretary, so I was on the media bus with the reporters day in, day out through the course of that campaign period. And a couple of them said, "You guys don't seem bugged by anything. Like, in the early days, things are not going really great for you guys, but you seem okay with it." And I think part of it was we kind of had very little to lose because the PC party was a rump, in where it had been in the last two governments. And it was a long, slow rebuild. So it's not like we had the world by the tail and we're at risk of losing it. It was we kind of had nowhere to go but up.
Yeah, you talk about that shift in the polls and being down 25 points or 20 points at the outset, and that sounds very familiar based on what we just saw federally, Lindsay. And but the idea that I think Harris and the campaign in those days, say what you will about the the nature and the tone of the government, and I think we can say plenty, but I think the one lasting legacy is this whole idea that he said what he was going to do. He put it out there, told people what he was going to do, and then he just went ahead and did it, whether you liked it or not. The common sense revolution, that idea of as Bob said, stating the facts. Here's where we stand. Here's where we're going. A year ahead of the actual writ. That was brave, but also kind of changed the whole strategy around campaigning.
Yeah, and without having tomatoes thrown at me, I was in grade 8 when this all happened, so I have to admit I wasn't on my radar at all.
Except when there was a strike at school, right?
Yeah.
And that's
those were the Ray days. Yes, I remember the economy of the time. My dad was in construction, and it was an interesting time in Ontario. But as more a student of, I guess, history in this regard, I had the opportunity to work with many people who worked on this campaign, and I can say they're all leaders. Like, there was something in that campaign that brought together some fairly formidable men and women who went on to influence many others. So there's that. And also just hearing recent interviews, and you mentioned the Deb Hutton interview yesterday on 1010, I was struck by how much Mr. Harris still stuck to very high principled points of view. Like, he is fundamentally against any kind of deficits or running deficits. That's a very poignant and relevant strategic thread to where we all are today. And I think, it's worth unpacking some of that stuff. So I have no memory or relevance of the time, but, like all politics, it influences the present.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, the idea in terms of some of the characters that came up as a result of that, for those of you who don't remember, but, it was highly unlikely that OPSU, the provincial, union representing employees for the government, would ever go on strike. That just was not part of the culture. And then, Leah Castleman comes along and tangles with Mike Harris, and we have the days of action. And, that changed a whole lot in terms of government relationships with the public service.
Yeah, I take a step back during the Ray days. That's when, I was struggling as a volunteer. I was working as a nurse, but I was struggling in a rape crisis center. We were all volunteers and we were work. The Ray government gets in, and they just flooded money at women's services and shelters and rape crisis centers. We were getting money faster than we could even spend. So we went through this kind of high with it, but then we went through, as Bob said, the recession. It was terrible. And to deal with the recession, they thought we would all sing Kumbaya and take these Ray days, which, you take days off that you wouldn't be paid for. And that was supposed to be for the greater good. Created a lot of dissent. And I think it set the stage, as well as the recession itself, for the Mike Harris government to come in. And we were seeing this common sense, and all the way through it. I think if you don't look at Mike Harris, though, and his the impact that he had on all kinds of things, there was some really good, some really, really bad. And it's important that if you're going to do a historical look at his tenure, there was some terrible situations with Ipperwash, with tainted water scandals. There was, and I think people tend to gloss over that, which is unfortunate, because there are important lessons in all of that. So that was, but those were those days when the rape crisis movements and other women's movements, they were then going to claw back during the Mike Harris years the money that we'd gotten during the Bob Ray years. And that's when I really got my feet wet in the protest movement. So it's interesting to see how the U.S. is dealing with protests now, and what we learned when we were protesting. It's a seriously interesting time, how history can repeat itself and what we learn and what we don't learn. But it reminded me when Bob reminded us of the 30 years, just freaking how old I am. But secondly, just how cyclical these things are, and how they change or they don't change. And it reminded me a lot. But I remember for years afterwards, because he eventually was very much hated. The common sense words were hated. They were banished from many people's and government's vocabulary for many years. And it was interesting how they resurfaced during Poilievre's campaign. His common sense is constantly being repeated again, but for many years you didn't say common sense. That had become like just a no-no. You just didn't go there. But it's interesting. We seem to be back there.
Well, the interesting part for me in the common sense comment, Bob, is that what Mike Harris meant by common sense is not what Donald Trump means by common sense. I mean, there's no sense to Donald Trump's common sense. You could actually pull a thread through the common sense document and say, well, that makes sense. We need to be doing these things. There was some logic. There was some foundational, argument for them. And we could argue one way or the other, but it wasn't a matter of tearing down institutions and so on. So the sad thing is, against the backdrop of the conversation that, Mike Harris has been having with folks, and certainly with Deb Hutton yesterday, is that's what people are hearing when they hear common sense revolution. So it's kind of hard for him to get out from underneath that historically.
Yeah, and it was named that very deliberately, very specifically, because for the reasons as you say, Dave, that if you read through it, whether you wholeheartedly agreed with it or not, there was a logic to it. There was truly common sense to it, and it was revolutionary at the same time to say, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to cut spending, and that combination will invigorate the economy and create the growth that will enable us to balance the budget and do the other things that we're trying to achieve here. So there was a thread that ran through it, and it was revolutionary thinking at the time. Last point I'll make is there's a book came out about a year ago that is a collection of essays that was curated by one of the members of our campaign team, Alistair Campbell. And he reached out to writers from various spectrums, from academia, from industry, from business, from social organizations, and not all of them conservatives, to give their take, to look back at certain aspects of Harris policies that were brought in at that time. And it's a very telling read, because nothing has fundamentally been reversed in terms of some of the big, bold measures that were taken. Subsequent governments have not reversed them. They didn't dramatically re-increase welfare rates after we brought them back to an average rate based on what other provinces were paying out. They didn't. They haven't separated Toronto back into 6 municipalities. They haven't put the monolith of Ontario Hydro back together. So there's a long list of things that were revolutionary at the time, but subsequent governments have, by the same token, not messed with either.
Yeah, interesting to me. You talk about some of the people and the leaders that came out of that campaign team, Lindsay, and people that you have worked with. On the flip side, Kathleen Wynne will tell you that the reason she got into politics is because of Mike Harris. That she ran to become a school board trustee, and off she went. So, and you mentioned that sort of the life cycle and the rhythm of the actual politics and the governance of the province, there you have cause and effect right away, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and we're having it right now, right? I'd argue Carney is an effect of a very serious and formidable cause as well. So, but we're gonna see some sort of repercussion following Ford. We'll see a repercussion following Trump. These things, I do believe, happen. And what we're seeing in Los Angeles, these movements back and forth, we're always tempering who we are as societies and what our vision of the good is. Old Platonic ideas kind of raised to the surface again and again, and we have to right size. What Harris did then, would it be repeated now? I unlikely. It was a moment in time. It was reactionary to what had been before it. There was some great ideas within it, but at the same time, it is situated and in that historical route. But the people and players. We find ourselves in terms of who we are and how political we are in reaction to other things, both the good and the bad.
Well, part of that would have been the protests at Queen's Park, et cetera, and in the day it would have been considered that the OCAP drama with the OPP on the front lawn, Bob, was quite memorable, and people kind of got into it, and that was viewed as this, oh my God, we have never seen this in Ontario before. But if you actually compared what happened then to what's going on today in Los Angeles, that was a freaking Tea Party.
Mhm.
Yeah. Very much so.
Right. I mean, the idea that there was any kind of real threat or how people behaved was something again. But it made me wonder about sort of the point of protest. That if in fact you're going to demonstrate, who is your audience, right, Emery? I mean, if you're looking at it and saying, I'm going to scream at the cops or throw stuff at the police, then guess what? Is that the actual point of your protest? And I thought it was interesting against the backdrop of what went on or what is going on in Los Angeles with National Guard, with local police, with the Marines being called up, et cetera, that the demonstrators seem to be taking it out on the cops on the front line. I understand why, but if you want to make a point, there's some thought that just sit and be quiet, and they take a page out of the civil rights demonstrations from the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, sometimes the protests are strategic in nature. They aren't motivated. They're always motivated to make a change, and depending on what audience you're looking for. Generally, though, they are politicians. You're wanting to make the change, or you're wanting to encourage change in our justice system, for example. But it still usually requires change from a government, and whether it's a policy, whether it's a law, whether it's a decision, that kind of thing. And sometimes they're very, very strategic. You have a group of people or a leader at the top that is making strategic decisions about where, when, how you protest. But sometimes it's very emotionally driven. It kind of is very grassroots driven. And I attended lots and lots of protests where something happened and very quickly it enraged, it upset, it made people sad, whatever. And they were spontaneously, someone said, let's do it here. And you kind of all just did it. So, and sometimes it's often it's not thought through to the end. Who are we trying to speak to? And because it's so emotionally driven, it's often at the front lines, whoever is there in your face. And that is sometimes the police, that can be the army, it can be, it just depends who is trying to control the emotion on the ground. And those people become the targets. And then you always have in the middle of protests that are full of rage and full of emotion like that, outliers that feel differently and then conflict with people on the ground. So it's a really challenging thing. And today I wouldn't take the risk. I used to take my little kids to all kinds of protests, but we were mostly women. So tended to be, we are very much holding hands and singing kind of stuff. And my boys got dragged to a lot of those kinds of things. But sometimes it was fueled by, for example, survivors and outraged by a decision, and they could get pretty heated. And so I used to make a decision. Is this one's going to be super heated and, not safe for my children? But today, I'm not sure I'd go to any protests. They can get very complicated and very high risk. And perhaps it's my age, or it's just my experience, or I see what's happening in places like LA. I have no doubt that somebody's going to die there. No doubt.
Well, high risk or hijacked, I think, is also the issue, right, Lindsay? In terms of if there are people there who have brought the emotion and the rage, which is justifiable, let's say, but at the same time, there are those who are just there to raise shit, and they just want to cause problems. And doesn't matter what demonstration I was ever covering, that was always a concern historically, where you'd have some of the outliers just come in and these are the local hellraisers, and they were going to cause problems. Doesn't matter what the cause was. So that has more or less become the tone and the outcome of protests these days, and I think social media has a lot to do with that. So I don't know that you can have a strategic or an artful approach to demonstration that's effective.
I don't know. You're asking such good questions. When you look back at the civil rights movement, and again, I don't know if the edges of history have just been chiseled away, so we see it as this very coherent, singled message event. Was it Selma to Montgomery walk, right? Like, that is so clear to me in terms of the images, the hand in hand, the strength. When you compare that, I think it was like those 1% movement protests that happened around the 28 economic crisis. I'm hoping I'm getting all this right.
Yep.
But that seemed to be the first time when the headlines were, it's unclear who all these people are or where they're coming from. There seems to be just general angst against the system. And maybe now in hindsight, it's more clear how those people all fit together, because I think there's a natural thread between that and what's happening in the States right up to Trump, frankly. And we saw that with the trucker protests here. There are red threads that connect some of these things. It's just that the headline's so much it's messier. And I think the divisions between us as communities and society have become more murky. It's very easy looking back in history to see like Black communities, white communities, Jim Crow America, and where it was going to move from that moment. It's hard to see what the next logical iteration of where we are is right now. Maybe it'll make sense. But yeah, to Anne-Marie's point, protesting right now is an extreme sport, because you've got political movements colliding that aren't born of our society. They're foreign, being played out on domestic soil, and it's really hard to interpret the iterations and logical flow of all these people, because they all bring their own individual perspective and vibe to the day.
Well, I was flipping through the Substack newsletters this weekend, and I came across one from Peter Coyote, the actor, Bob, and he had this sort of point by point by point. Here's how you can effectively manage and get results from demonstration. And part of his closing was, vent at home, in public, practice discipline and self-control. Okay, that just killed the whole argument, because we have so normalized being abusive in public and getting away with it without accountability that nobody's going to follow that really good advice if you want to make your point. That's just not going to happen.
And protests actions have really changed over the years, to the point where now they are usually excuses just to break stuff and yell and scream. And that co-opts the message. And I read the Peter Coyote piece, and he's bang on that when he says things like, dress nicely when you go out to protest, because the images of people in presentable clothing, it's a lot harder to make you look like a bunch of anarchistic freaks versus those who show up in balaclavas and combat fatigues and all of that kind of stuff. I covered protests when I was a reporter at the beginning of my career, and I never saw the violent ones and the extreme ones like we've seen over the years. The 1% stuff that Lindsay was talking about, the G20 protest in Toronto, burning police cars, and that kind of extreme stuff is always going to be the focal point for the media coverage. I mean, conflict sells. Conflict is interesting. Violence is even more interesting. And so those flashpoint moments are always going to lead the coverage. But what does that do to the message of those who organized the protest in the first place and the point they're trying to make? It gets lost. It gets lost right away. And it's a highly ineffective way of sending a message, unlike, the Martin Luther King era peaceful protests of the civil rights movement, or the kinds of level-headed actions that Peter Coyote calls for, saying, this is how you protest and really drive the message to the audience that you're trying to reach. And that's what all of us around this table, do every day.
Yeah. Just a question to throw in the mix for you guys. Do you think what we're seeing in Los Angeles, are they protests? Because I'm also thinking about like the Rodney King reaction, also same area. When you think of Martin Luther King, there's an academic discipline behind it that took time to mobilize and teach. Whereas right now, these people are kind of fighting for their lives in a more direct way. And I'm just like, is this protest? And maybe I'm looking at it through a different lens. I'm not, and I ask it honestly. I don't know the answer to the question.
It's a good question, and I think it was, but I think for the most part, they're protesting over manufactured conflicts, and that's what Donald Trump does all the time. He just kind of manufactures a crisis or a conflict or a problem. And there were protests, actual protests about decisions that were made, especially the decisions that were happening on the ground with him using ICE to get rid of immigrants. And so there were those kind of protests. But then at the protests, there were, he again manufactured. He ensures that the violence is kicked up a notch, and that just perpetuates protests because the anger gets amped up and up. That's what the whole thing, and he's doing it all to justify it. When I heard Donald Trump talking about, he was using words. What did they call the insurrectionists? I can't say the word. Which is how they referred to, he was doing that the exact same thing when Biden got in. That's what he's calling these protesters now, that they're hired guns, and he's doing all of that. So he's tainting them. And I think people on the ground are really, really struggling with, where we see the policies and the decisions he's making from afar, and it makes us really super anxious. But for the most part, they're not directly impacting us or most Americans, but on people that are protesting, it is really affecting them. They're losing family members, and they're losing jobs, and they're losing all kinds of things immediately from Donald Trump. And so they have it sets it up for this perpetuating thing. So protest is a very general word. You can be a single protester by when Rosa Parks refused to move from that bus. she was a protester. She protested, and then more did that. And to Bob's point, I wanted to say about the whole, or Peter Coyote's point about dress nice, when many of the Black movements, if you look back in history, all of the protests, they were peaceful. They were dressed beautifully. They were the most effective change that happened because there was en masse, and they were peaceful, and it was a very, they made sure that their message was heard, and it didn't get deflected by violence that happens, and that's what you can focus on instead. Then when people on the ground are violent, or looting, or the things that happen at protests, then that's what they focus on, instead of there was this peaceful, 10,000 people marching together for a cause, and they affected change that way.
Yeah, I think we got to be careful about sort of having this broad brush that sort of inoculates us from the violence that did happen in some of those demonstrations as well in the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s. Where Eisenhower had to call in the National Guard so that Black kids could go to school, and it straight. You had the white supremacist kind of attitude on the street, screaming at the Black kids who were going into the school. So there was a high level of violent tension in those, and there were a lot of people who were injured as a result. But I think to the point being, where there was purpose in that, it wasn't a surprise to anybody that the march would have happened on a given day with this number of people. King and his company would have telegraphed that days in advance. They knew what was going on. But I think in the case that we see now, and you know what, Bob, it might even be something that we see across the country as the whole question around consulting First Nations again is considered vis-a-vis large infrastructure projects and mining projects. We're starting to hear that, if you don't listen to us, we're going to actually have our days of civil disobedience as well. And we have seen in the past, back to the, they have become violent and problematic. It gets lost in terms of what the message is. And so, do we consult with First Nations? Sure. Do they hold up a railway line? I don't know. But, and that becomes then counterproductive in terms of the message and trying to actually achieve what it is you want to do.
Right. Yeah, it's really no different than some of the other examples that we've cited. That it undermines your message. If your tactics swamp your message, then you've lost the thread. And so, I hope we don't return to those days. But we'll see. It's going to be a tall order for Carney and company.
Well, and Ford as well. I mean, I think they're all kind of have their own fires, rings of fire, so to speak, that they're going to have to deal with. So, it's easy to look south and say, those bad guys. Well, we have that level of that similar kind of posture and culture here, and there is a risk that we're going to have to face some of that. I just want to, I don't know how you guys reacted though. We're all paying attention, generally, more than most people. And I thought, holy shit, he's called out the National Guard in California. Now, I realize other presidents have done it in the past, but again, to the point where they called it out to protect civil rights and civil liberties. That's not why he's calling it out. I don't know, Lindsay. I just kind of had this chill up my spine as soon as I saw that happened. And then the military. The idea that you'd have U.S. military boots on the ground to deal with essentially people who disagree with the policies of the Republican government. I don't know.
It's weaponizing the system that's supposed to defend us, them. But it feels like us a bit. I don't know if I have anything more really to add. It feels horrible and gross, and it is going to continue to trigger perhaps what he wants to trigger, and that's what I worry about. And I know it's very conspiracy theorist that he's heading down this path to create instability. But man, does it feel that way? Like on every accord, we, the royal we, have enabled and allowed him to break laws, and predominantly Americans have done this. They voted someone in who is a criminal with many counts against him and his character, knowingly. So that's one, but it just kind of escalates. And he seems to, at every turn, break laws, break ethical rules and boundaries, and the system enables it. And to add salt to the wound constantly, he manipulates the media and the narrative, so it's uncertain whether the people he's manipulating most are getting the true story, or even anything version, So I this is going to be one for me where I just don't know. Please, inform me, make me feel okay about this, guys. But it just doesn't feel too good.
Not to make you feel worse, Lindsay, but we have a G7 meeting coming.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
That's right.
And those always target protesters, and they can get really totally out of control. And I think this year is going to be, I'm really watching for it with trepidation, because I think it's going to be a difficult situation. And I am sure they are in the back rooms now discussing it and how they're going to protect not only the leaders, but everyone else, because it could get totally out of control given the leaders that are going to be there, including Trump.
Well, the geography is helpful.
Yeah.
This is the second one, I believe, consecutively that's been held at Kananaskis. The last time we hosted the G7 or G20 or whatever G it was, they did it there because it's an easy site to isolate and insulate from protest activity. It's an easy place to keep people away from, and it's a hard place, flip side, it's a hard place for a lot of activists to descend upon, just by the nature of its location and the fact that it's up in the mountains like it is.
Well, I remember the effort for the G20 back in, what was that, 2010, 2011 here in Toronto, and trying to fence it off. Remember that?
Yeah.
The idea.
Disaster.
And that was just a complete disaster. I mean, it didn't work. And there were so many points in Toronto that could be targeted, Queen's Park being one of them, but then just, Bay Street was one of them, up and down Queen Street, the vandalism that happened. There was no way for police at the time to be able to contain any of it until, they successfully kettled everybody at what was it, Bathurst and Spadina, something like that, downtown in the rain. But, even there, no matter how well prepared you are, Bob, it's going to open up law enforcement to all kinds of criticism. I don't think, Bill Blair ever lived that down.
Yeah. Sure. And the bad actors thrive on that and depend on that. They force the conflict. The Toronto G20 was a great example, because that's where we learned about the Black Bloc and these truthfully anarchists who co-opt what were otherwise intended to be peaceful, message-driven actions with the violence, with the sensational action, with the hooded, covered faces, camouflage, black combat outfits. So that conflict. They thrive on that conflict, and they go out of their way to make it happen and to be provocative agents.
Yeah, I remember even in the tactics in those days, Lindsay, the idea that they would have these roving, units that would kind of crawl around different streets, different alleys with a view. We're all going to meet here. So there was no way of containing them, because all the entire group kind of converged from different areas of the city. They were highly sophisticated in terms of how they were going to use their tactics to demonstrate against what was going on at G20. But to the point that's been made earlier, what exact point were they making? It was almost impossible to actually say that there was one singular issue that people were demonstrating against at that point. And I think that's where we are in Los Angeles.
Maybe. Yeah, most likely. Looking back at the Toronto event, like in the time, if I'm remembering the muscle memory I had, the consensus seemed to be that the police mishandled things. Looking back, though, I think they were given an impossible task. If you think of the nature of any downtown core, especially a very unique downtown core like Toronto compared to other downtown cores where people live there, it's not like the mass exodus that happens in most city centers, at the end of the 9 to 5 day, and it's just empty blocks. What a bizarre task to actually host an event like that I can't imagine that ever happening again. I don't know. In terms of what it's about, I agree with you, though. There are so many levels that have been brought everyone's temperature up, and they're unnegotiated. October 7th is permeating through, I think, the level of aggression, anger, mistrust, divisiveness on that issue alone has only increased because we haven't addressed it direct. We were talking about talking and communications last week, building bridges. That's a case in point. And Trump has a unique ability to put a poison pill in everything to create divides. He's very skilled tactician in that regard. When you have leaders of as many countries, plus if we're inviting Modi from India, plus if we're inviting, and I forgot his name, I'm sorry, the leader of Saudi Arabia.
Mohammed bin Salman.
Thank you.
Salman, yeah.
You're adding so many issues into a country that houses all of these people, and we're trying to get on and get by. It's hard to do that when we're the host of it all, unless we can demonstrate that there is a desire to have conversation and actually move forward. I can't think of too many solutions that come from events like this. I can only think of problems.
Right. So, but let's, before we go, I just wouldn't mind touching on that because, Bob, the idea that has been floated, Toronto, Canada, and the United States will have a trade deal before the G7, and that was coming up a week from now. That this was all going to happen, and as there was momentum behind that conversation, two things were happening. We talked about the expectations of the Carney government, and so far, I think that's they're still on the plus side on that in terms of the actions that they've taken. But the other part of the narrative now is that it might not just be Canada. That in fact G7 might be the site of solutions for a number of U.S. Relationships with trade vis-a-vis other G7 countries. So it might be out of the blue, but something that we didn't expect is that this G7 meeting might in fact be a catalyst for a whole lot of solution that we had hoped to have in the face of the Trump chaos.
It could well be. I think that's ambitious to shoot for. But the fact is, when you get enough high-level people together in the same room, a lot can come out of it. And one thing we know is Trump can't keep playing the game globally that he's been playing on a sustained basis. There has to be a resolution to this. And he's burning tremendous political capital to keep fighting with the world and to keep tariffing the world. And he's losing traction on it. So it would not be surprising, hugely surprising, if there weren't a number of multilateral resolutions coming to the fore in the near term. And the fact that they are going to be in the room together does create that opportunity. Again, I think it's very ambitious. I think it's very hopeful, but we'll see.
Well, the one thing that kind of makes me kind of lean that way, Anne-Marie, is that just yesterday or 2 days ago, the president of Mexico says, "I'm coming," and I thought, really? You're like, it's a week out and you're confirming that you're going to be there. So there's something going on in talks behind closed doors that are going to make it worthwhile for her to be there. And does that mean a Canada, US, Mexico deal gets, I don't know, but it just for me was a tell that, there's something else going on here where otherwise we would have taken it for granted. Of course, the Mexican president's going to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, I keep imagining what it's going to be like. And I think the only way it's going to really go well is if Trump doesn't go. And there's part of me, I think, thinking that he won't go. He'll send somebody else because he is, this event is structured so that to get work done, bring people together, to really hammer out solutions and to put the spotlight on issues. And that's not Trump. Trump is all about him, and the spotlight would have to be on him. And he would be spending any moment he had there, pushing out stupid messages on social media that contradict what he just said at the table. So I just don't think he's going to go. That's my guess. And I really hope he doesn't, because I think Carney can really effectively get some good shit done at this meeting. And I think that will benefit the world. And I think for the first time, I'm really, really very relieved that we have, and I say this with all due respect, the most boring prime minister we've had in a long time. I don't have to think about him or worry about him.
I'm sorry, Mr. Harper was no,
Okay. He was kind of boring too, but for a while we haven't had a boring.
Neck there.
Yeah, and I've been bored, and when I say bored, I mean he's just doing his job, and I feel kind of confident that he's doing his job and he's doing it well. And the fact that people got all excited about his most recent announcement about defense spending, well, most people don't know anything about the defense spending or care about it. But most people on the street thought that was a really great idea. I just don't think most people care. Well, because they don't know. They don't know, like, do we spend?
No, I think you're right. I think you're right on the first point. They don't care. And so, where on the messaging for Carney, Lindsay, will be, look, I said we were going to do it. We're back to the Mike Harris model. I'm telling you what I'm going to do, and now I'm going to do it, and I'm going to get patted on the back for doing it, whether you like it or not. And he will talk about defense as an example. And, I think the surprise was we'll get to 2% by the end of this year. So, oh, wow, that caught everybody's attention. But ask people whether or not, okay, that some of that money is going to come out of healthcare, and some of that money is going to come out of, education, whatever it might be, that where the government has an envelope of money, because otherwise he's going to have to raise taxes. So then people will look at it and say, well, no, I don't want you cutting money out of my healthcare. I don't want people, cutting money out of infrastructure planning. I don't want taking money out of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So does he actually follow through and make it? Because he's going to have to make some really tough decisions. Making the announcement was one thing. Following through and finding the money and making it a priority over other envelopes, that's going to be the real issue in the next 8 months.
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is that a lot of the money has already been earmarked, and that it's going to be repositioned so that it all falls within this 2% bucket. I've listened to different other sources. I lay no claim on that, but that's my understanding, is that the net impact to the ratepayers won't be significant this time round, because we're going to be right sizing what has been frankly a lost file. And my 2 cents only, I don't know how my colleagues on the panel feel, but I think it's a good investment. And it's one that I think a lot of Canadians who do know or follow have defended across party lines. It seems to be a fairly strong nonpartisan issue, which is, again, a very good thing, and will impact other core regions like the Maritimes, like Alberta, like the far north, that need to see a little more cohesion on files that matter to them. Plus, it's investments in industry, technologies, and others, where, again, I think the spending was already happening, but we're just rejigging. So from a tax point of view or a cost point of view, I'm not too concerned this time round. When the language starts touting 5%, which we're now hearing from other jurisdictions, I start to bite my nails a little bit, because I don't think we're set up for any of that anytime soon. But we have to get the infrastructure right. We need to get some talent. We need to rebuild the entire sector. It doesn't exist in a functional way here in Canada, it seems, from all accounts. So this seems to be the right move. And going back to the various Gs and NATO and all the rest, we would not have had a seat at those tables in any way other than being a laughingstock had he not made that decision. So if we want these international alliances and bridges to be built, it was an investment in our future in as much as it was a political promise.
Yeah, I guess, Bob, the challenge is making the announcement is one thing, and that's the politics of this. But at the same time, talk to retired Major General Scott Clancy from the RCAF, and he used to be the director of operations at NORAD, so very much focused on the kind of conversations that we're having here in this country around our sovereignty, Arctic, etc. And he will tell you that the biggest roadblock is Treasury Board. As soon as it gets into the Treasury Board, and that's way down in the weeds, and that's so far out of everyone's peripheral vision, we're not going to understand that. Yes, there's money there, but D&D can't spend it. They just don't have the capacity to spend the money because of a whole bunch of structural issues. It's such a complicated file that this might kind of blow up in his face 8 months from now.
I've heard that, and I have trouble getting my head around any part of any government having trouble spending money when it's given a pile of money to spend. They seem to be really good at that, and given how expensive defense projects are, and the technology, the hardware, the equipment, all of that. Plus, there's a lot earmarked, and I think rightly so, for military salaries. They do deserve a bump, and a lot of that's been overdue. So much of where this new money is going is into old places that just haven't been properly topped up by the previous government or previous governments put together. I agree with Lindsay. I think 2% is table stakes for Canada to have credibility at the international table, not only with Donald Trump, because we know that scores his points with him, but with the other NATO partners, especially. We needed to get there. But 5% is 2.5 times 2%. And if 2% is a big mountain for us to get to, I'm also with Lindsay on that. I don't know how we could possibly do 5.
Well, just the math on the getting to the 2% would mean increasing the annual budget right now by 50%. That's from people I've talked to. That's what you're at. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. So, yeah. But you're right. Again, we'll get down in the weeds and lost in a hurry. And then it's, do you care or do you not? And we'll kind of watch that come out in the wash. All right, let's leave it there, and we'll watch with interest to see what happens with the G7 coming up later this month, and we'll let y'all take notes, and we'll come back and we'll kick it around and see who was right. Who's got the over and under on whether or not Anne-Marie's right?
Yeah,
that's fascinating. I like that idea.
Let's get the online betting going on that one. All right, Lindsay Broadhead, Anne-Marie Aikins, Bob Reid, thank you all for being here. I'm Dave Trafford. This is Now and Next. And by the way, we will be recording On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I know the legislature is not going to be in session until after Thanksgiving, but the Ontario Politics podcast continues for a couple of weeks anyway, and I do want to get their take on what happens in Kananaskis as well. So we will be recording that in a couple of days from now. So if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel right now, because you get Now and Next, but you also get On the Ledge as it falls into the feed, and wherever you happen to be listening to this podcast, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, on the Ledge is there as well. So subscribe, find it, and click the subscribe button, and we'll be in your inbox on a regular basis. All right. Thanks for being here. I'm Dave Trafford, and this is Now and Next for Story Studio Network.